August 20th, 2008. A passenger jet in Spain crashed 10 seconds after takeoff. 154 people were killed, including passengers and crew. As per usual, when a plane crashes, it's never just one thing that causes the crash. Upon taking a look into this story, sadly, this crash could have been easily avoided. This is the story of Spanair Flight 5022. It's midday at Madrid-Barajas Airport in Spain on August 20th, 2008. Boarding Spanair Flight 5022 are 166 passengers and 6 crew. The 3-hour flight had a destination of Gran Canaria Airport in the Canary Islands. The passengers were multinational from many different countries, most of them being from Spain, mostly tourists looking for a holiday from the stifling heat in Madrid. In the cockpit was 39-year-old Captain Garcia Luna. He was an experienced pilot with over 8,000 flight hours, ex-military in the Spanish Air Force, being a flight instructor and flight test pilot, after which he'd been flying for Spanair for 9 years. He had the reputation for being a great pilot, but with a lack of the ability to coordinate and create rapport with his crewmates. In the co-pilot seat was 31-year-old Francisco Javier Mulet. He wasn't as experienced with only 1,200 flight hours. His reputation was that of a passionate pilot who always made an effort to be polite. The McDonnell Douglas aircraft was a 15-year-old MD-82. It was a popular aircraft that had a reputation for being extremely safe. The tragic reality of this crash is that it had been very close to not happening at all. At 1:30 p.m., the pilots communicated to the tower that they were ready for takeoff. They were cleared for takeoff, and then they radioed back that there had been a minor problem. They requested to exit the runway, and ATC cleared them to do so. They asked maintenance to take a look at the ram air temperature probe. The pilots noticed that it was reading too high of a temperature. The probe is responsible for reading the temperature of the air near the surface of the aircraft's skin. At high speeds, friction in the air causes the aircraft's surface to heat up. It helps the pilots know when to turn off anti-icing and aids in telling when there is a low engine throttle. Because the reading was showing high, the pilots didn't want to take a chance and take off with a possible low engine throttle. The probe has a heating element, and so the maintenance crew instructed the captain to pull the heating element circuit breaker to turn off the heating element, thinking that that would solve the problem. However, the reading of the temperature was still way too high. They brought the aircraft back to the gate so the maintenance guys could take a look. The pilots and maintenance crew worked together to try to figure out the problem, but nothing they did seemed to work. At one point, it was even suggested to try using dry ice to cool down the probe manually. It was a stifling hot summer day, and the cockpit was a beehive of activity, with technicians and pilots coming in and out. The passengers sat rather impatiently since there was no air conditioning to cool down the cabin. The pressure to get the plane ready was mounting. Without any luck, they decided to just pull the circuit breaker and label the probe inoperational and send the aircraft on its way. The probe is not listed in the minimum equipment list required for flight. By 2 p.m., the plane was getting refueled with the pilot overseeing the refueling personally. He was in a rush and needed to make sure it happened quickly. With the airplane refueled, they started the procedure for takeoff again. They were in a rush with an antsy cabin full of passengers. And the heat was stifling. The first officer radioed the wrong tower because he didn't change the frequency on the radio. Everything was rushed and things were being overlooked. The captain started to run through the checklist on his own. He had it memorized by now, but it was the responsibility of the first officer to call out the instructions while the captain performed the checks. Being in a rush, the captain went ahead outside of procedure. Another responsibility of the first officer is to radio ATC, but again, the captain took it on his own accord to do that himself. They started the engines and continued with the checklists. The last item on the checklist was to check the flaps and slats, but as the first officer read it out, the captain interrupted him to radio for taxi permission from ATC. They never returned to complete the final task on the before taxi checklist. The flaps remained not configured properly for takeoff. They started taxiing and began the taxi checklist. One of the items on the checklist is to check if an indicator light is on. The light is responsible for indicating that the reverse thrust system is available. The light can only be on if the slats are properly configured for takeoff. The light was off and the pilots didn't notice, and the slats remained not properly configured for takeoff. The checklist then goes on where the pilots are supposed to review takeoff speeds, thrust, and flaps, amongst other things. The pilots skipped this step and again missed their chance to check the flaps. They made idle conversation with a third pilot sitting in the jump seat and lined up the aircraft for takeoff. The final checklist before takeoff was read out, their last chance to fix the situation. The co-pilot read out that the flaps were in position 11, ready for takeoff, but they were not. They were at position 0. This piece of information confused investigators the most. The co-pilot was running through the motions of the checklist, but not actually making the checks. At this point, there was no way to stop the crash except for one last thing. The takeoff warning system usually sounds an alarm if the pilots apply takeoff thrust when the aircraft isn't properly configured for takeoff, but the alarm never sounded. Why? We'll get into that more later in the video. They began the takeoff and reached takeoff speed of 157 knots. The first officer pulled back and brought the plane into the air. However, as soon as it was airborne, the stall warning went off. The stick shaker activated and the aircraft started to bank to the right. With the aircraft 40 feet in the air, the first pilot thought it was an engine failure and reduced the throttle all the way. But it was too late. The aircraft tail hit the ground first. The aircraft dragged on the ground and then started sliding towards an embankment. It hit the other side of the embankment hard and immediately burst into flames. The whole thing happened in just 10 seconds after takeoff. Out of all 172 passengers and crew, only 18 survived, making the worst airplane crash accident to happen in Spain in 25 years. An investigation was launched immediately. Obviously, it was the flaps not being set properly which caused the crash, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The reason of why they weren't set goes much deeper. Returning to the beginning of the video, at their first attempt at takeoff, the flaps were set properly, but they returned to the gate because of the overheated probe. The probe had been overheated on many previous flights that had taken off successfully. The crew deciding to investigate the probe is actually one of the main reasons the aircraft ended up crashing. The time pressure made them rush through the checklists and miss the flaps. But more importantly, they ended up pulling the circuit breaker for the probe. What they didn't know was that when they pulled the circuit breaker from the ram air temperature probe, it cut off power going to a relay connected to the takeoff alarm that would have sounded, warning the pilots about the flaps. There are many circuit breakers in an aircraft. There are also many relays in an aircraft. Sometimes avionics designers have no choice but to double up connecting one circuit breaker to multiple relays. So that's the reason why multiple relays were disabled when they pulled that circuit breaker, including one that had control over the takeoff warning system. Boeing later reported that it was aware of 6 cases where there was a high temperature reading on the ram air temperature probe and a malfunctioning takeoff warning system, 4 of which were solved by replacing a relay that both systems draw power from. The exact details of this malfunction has never been established, but the final report recommended that there is a procedure to test the takeoff warning system prior to flight. They also suggested that the design of the aircraft does not allow for a single point failure of the takeoff warning system. Another thing that led to the crash is if the first officer kept the nose higher up, they could have climbed safely. The final report recommends training for takeoff stall recovery for airline pilots. Additionally, they recommended adding training for crew resource management, as this was probably the #1 cause of the crash under the rushed circumstances. If you liked this video, subscribe to get more content like this. And remember that flying is still statistically the safest way to travel, with instances like these almost never happening.